I'm Fred Hutton reporting live from the lobby of Confederation Building. Just behind these doors here, in about a minute or two from now, the province's Finance Minister Tom Osborne will bring down his first budget. You're looking at a shot inside the House now as members of the House of Assembly gather for what is this administration's third budget in Newfoundland and Labrador. We've been in a lockup all morning, most reporters in the province, digesting what's in this document. We can tell you that it's called Building for Our Future. We can't tell you what's in it yet until the Finance Minister stands up. What we can tell you, though, is that Larry Short is standing to my right, and he will be providing analysis today on what's in the budget. Larry, of course, from Holliswell. Thanks for coming by.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
The sun is shining outside.
It's a beautiful day.
I always think about that expression that Brian Peckford used, one day the sun will shine and have not will be no more. I'm not sure if we're there yet, but at least we have the sunshine today.
Yes, so what we've seen so far, what we've seen in the details of the budget is, well, to put it in short, it's a nothing burger.
Yeah, but we can't get into it right now. We have to wait until the Finance Minister stands up. We can't reveal too many of the details. But the Finance Minister is walking into the House of Assembly, or he's on his feet now. So, the nothing burger. What's on this nothing burger?
It's pretty much a continuation of the budget that was put in place last year. There's some small tweaks and a few sweet items for the electorate, but there's essentially no dramatic change. There's no increase in taxes by any means, and the deficit is tracking pretty much with what was expected last year. The total revenue is $7.67 billion, and the expenses are still $8.36 billion.
So spending quite a bit more, almost $750 million more than we're taking in. What we want to do over the next hour, basically on radio, online, and Facebook Live, our stream, is let you know a little bit about what's in there. We're going to bring reporters into the conversation to let you know what they've seen so far. And as Larry mentioned, there are no new taxes. This is what people primarily want to know. The average person out there watching this or listening to it wants to know, what is it going to cost at the end of the day? Essentially, it's not going to cost anything because there's no new taxes in there. The slight reduction, which we reported about earlier yesterday, related to the tax, which is on auto insurance only, not on your life insurance or your home insurance. But look, we're going to take you through this over the next hour. Let's first of all go inside and listen briefly to what the Finance Minister, Tom Osborne, is saying.
It's difficult to imagine the impact on our morale, cultural and economic fibre. As a people, we were able to overcome that devastating impact. Our resilience allowed us to endure the economic challenges of the 1930s, and we persevered through the social and economic effects of the collapse of the cod fishery in the 1990s and the outmigration of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians that followed. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are strong. We are resilient. We have made significant progress over the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker, and we will overcome the fiscal challenges that our province now faces. We have reduced our deficit from the projected $2.7 billion to little more than $800 million today. We are on target to return to surplus, despite the volatility of oil prices. We are moving forward with a strong commitment to creating conditions for businesses and employment growth. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have an unwavering love of this province.
Osborne speaking in the House of Assembly right now, delivering his first budget and this government's third budget since being elected. We're going to bring Terry Roberts into the conversation now. Terry, you've been in the lockup with us all morning. We've already told folks that there are no tax increases, but what else stands out in this budget to you?
Well, a couple of nuggets I think that the government has thrown out there. You know, we're not far away from an election, so there is some relief here for taxpayers in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the first one you have to notice here is the little bit of a cut now for the insurance on your auto industry, auto on your vehicles. Only for autos, not for your home insurance or whatever. But we're going to see over the next 4 years, it's going to go from 15 down to 10% for that. So that's a little bit of something for people, right? A little bit of relief. And also, if you're a small company, a small business in Newfoundland and Labrador, there are some changes for you as well when it comes to payroll taxes. About 50 more companies right now are going to be exempted from paying payroll taxes because they're raising the threshold for those that companies have to pay payroll taxes from 1.2 to $1.3 million. So, and even companies that are bigger, there's about 1,200 companies that are going to save about $2,000 in payroll taxes effective in January of next year. So there are some things there for...
And this has been a big issue for smaller companies that are trying to make a go of it, facing increases in absolutely everything, including tax on insurance, and how they can ultimately employ people.
Right, so I mean, on the one hand, how can you say you want to improve employment in the province when some company goes and to hire an individual, and then you put a tax on them for hiring that individual. So, you know, any relief along that front is certainly appreciated.
Yeah.
What else is there, Terry?
Well, you know, we're still in the red. There's no question about that. You know, we were just told by the finance minister that for the current fiscal year that's about to end, our deficit is going to be about $812 million. Again, for a small province, $812 million. Although that's a little bit better than what they had projected at the mid-year update when they were looking at $852 million. So there is a trend in a positive direction, I guess is what the finance minister was trying to tell us today. So for the upcoming fiscal year, again, $683 million. We're going to be spending that much more than what we're bringing in this year. So, you know, it's come a long way. If you go back several years ago, they were projecting $2.7 billion deficits. So you can see the trend is positive, but still we're far from out of the hole in this province.
And that was the budget of 2016 that really sent a shockwave through this province. Every fee went up, everything went up. For the taxpayer. But here we are. How much of this is about consumer confidence? Because the government had to do a lot of damage control over the last couple of years to, okay, we're not going to have our mid-year budget, we're not going to do this, like, there's not going to be any layoffs, civil service jobs are safe, so go spend your money.
Well, remember in 2016, as was revealed by Minister Osmond, the provincial government at one point was potentially not going to make payroll. I mean, that was pretty scary. A period of time. So yes, there's definitely been progress made from in that period of time. As well, you know, as you're saying, the consumer confidence from the fact that there's no layoff clause with the unions, as well as the spending program that's going to be, I guess, brought forward with the fact that there's going to be severance paid out early, that's going to be significant.
Obviously, one of the big price tags here, I mean, health is the biggest, but payroll for civil servants, and we have a big civil service. What's happening there over the last year or so?
That's right. Well, if the government says we're still on track to have a balanced budget by 2022, 2023. Okay, and that's going to require, and the level of spending is going to be flat for that whole time. So attrition is the big word. That's how they're going to reach that target. There are thousands of public servants in this province who are eligible for retirement. So that's how they're hoping to save money. This year alone, they're not setting numbers in terms of job reductions. They're setting fiscal targets, they're calling them. So for this budget alone this year, they're hoping to trim about $5.2 million in salaries. Now that's on top of a 2015 plan, an attrition plan that was started by a previous administration.
And I think in the last 2 years, they said almost 800 people have retired from the civil service jobs they haven't replaced.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's you know, that's where they're going right now. You know, but still, severance is still costing us a lot of money. That's a part of the contracts that they negotiated. If you look at the deficit they're looking at for this year, $683 million. About $52 million of that is for severance. The buyout of the severance packages, that part of the collective agreements.
How much is the province borrowing this year?
Well, let's say it wasn't too long ago when we were borrowing $4+ million every day. Now we're down to about $1.8 million a day. But overall, we're going to borrow $1.6 billion this year.
And a large chunk of that is going to go to Muskrat Falls, or, well, to Nalcor.
Right. Well, Nalcor is our energy corporation, manages the energy resources here in this province. And Muskrat Falls, that controversial hydroelectric project in Labrador, is now about 90% complete. And the minister said today we're going to have first oil by November of next year. Well, government is going to, the public treasury is going to cut a check this year for Nalcor for $724 million. So that will give you an idea of how much we continue to spend on this contract, on this project.
Half of what the government is going to borrow. Okay, Terry, we're going to bring you back into the conversation in just a bit. What we do want to mention as well is, we'll talk to you about this, is the inquiry they're going to have for Muskrat Falls, which is going to cost almost $33 million. What we do want to do right now, though, is bring Ariana Kelland into the broadcast to talk a little bit about what's going on with our social media feeds, because we want people who are out there watching this broadcast or listening to it to contact us and let us know what their thoughts are.
That's right. So you may be listening to us on CBC Radio, but we also are watching your comments right now on our Facebook feed, YouTube, and on our website, cbc.ca/NL. So we're getting comments right now, people watching from Ontario, people watching from Cape Ray, Deer Lake, Bonavista. If you have a question, get it to us, write it in the comment section, and we will do our best to try to answer it. Of course, depending on what area you are in, there's more for you than others, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But any questions you have, send it our way, and also use the hashtag NLBudget2018 on Twitter, and we'll try to answer your questions as best we can.
What, are you hearing anything yet as to what people are thinking about this
No,
budget?
people are just waiting. They're waiting for details. And, you know, Fred, when we were discussing this in the lock-in, we were talking about, okay, well, how will this affect the pocketbook? Because that's one of the biggest things that people want to know. Okay, well, this is what the deficit is, this is what the debt is, but how is this going to affect me? And it seems like it's not one of those budgets where you're seeing fee increases to go into camping sites, increases to going into provincial parks. It doesn't appear that way right now. So the biggest things that you're going to see throughout the whole budget, little bits of money to continue projects. We're seeing $6.1 million, I believe, for the Waterford Hospital. Long been a controversial project. People want to see a replacement. Minister Haggie saying today that wait a week, there may be something a little later, an announcement on that. $300,000 for a new penitentiary, planning of a new penitentiary. Again, Fred, as you know, that's nothing new.
We've been doing that every year for the last few years.
Yeah, so it's items like that that they keep coming back every year. Now there is one item that you will see at least part of a completion by the end of the year, and that's the Team Gushu extension. Minister Crocker's telling reporters today that at least part of that highway that's been under construction for, I believe, 7 years will be finished to Topsail Road by the end of the year. So not a real budget that hurts the pocketbooks. It's more of a controversy avoiding budget, if anything. But there are some nuggets of details, some bits of funding for mental health services. We know U-Turn out in Carbonear, they're getting $120,000. So little bits of details like that, nothing that will really break the bank.
Yeah, so back to my initial point, which it's a nothing burger budget. There's not a lot of meat in this thing. It's more of maintain what the general thoughts were for last year. There's not a lot of substance to it, just tweaking along the way.
So, but you, from the big picture perspective, some of the things you look at from the investment world,
yes.
Obviously the bond rating agencies are looking very closely at Newfoundland and Labrador, because over the last 6 months or 8 months, we've heard the word bankrupt thrown around. Is the province bankrupt? The Premier has said absolutely not, we're not bankrupt. What will a bond rating agency like Standard & Poor's or Moody's look at and say, okay, they seem to have, the bleeding hasn't stopped, but it's not as heavy as it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, so there's still a couple of things here with the province, because we keep running into the comparison with New Brunswick, for example, which is also running deficits. But the difference between ourselves and New Brunswick is the reason that New Brunswick is running into deficits is because of a lack of revenue, whereas in the case of the province of Newfoundland, it's because of a spending more money than the revenue. So we still have a tremendous amount of revenue. It's just that the cost controls haven't been what we traditionally would expect in a province in Canada. We're still spending more per capita than any other province in the country, right? So when looking at this, the bond rating agency would say, if worse come to worse, if they had to cut expenses, they could. If something came up, maybe that gives them more confidence there.
Well, there's always been this debate and controversy over whether or not you run the province like a business. And because we've had business people running the province before, and certain cuts would be made if you owned a business that was doing what this is doing, but it's not. It's a province that involves people and taxes and their needs for social welfare and healthcare and education and everything else. So how do you do it? How do you balance that, but at the same time get reelected?
Right, and part of it as well is that one of the things that has come out of this budget is the fact that they're not forecasting any recession in the next 5 years, and that's a real key point here. It's kind of drowned out, it's kind of assumed in there, and they're pulling that, I think, from Bank of Canada forecast as well, because the federal government did the same thing. They're not forecasting any recession, and that's where the danger lies, because traditionally we've had a recession about every 4 years. The last one we had was 2008, was one of the worst in world history. So technically speaking, we're overdue for one. So if we do have a recession in the next 3-4 years, this could really upset the apple cart. And that's where the danger is, because if you're operating this close to the margin, if you are saying that your revenues are dependent on oil, it's depending on not having social welfare costs increasing, your unemployment level is still high, it's 15%, but what does it look like at 22? And if you get that revenue drop that would come from the federal government in the event of a recession, then that could push us to the wall. And that's where the hazard is.
Well, and there was an admission from the finance minister, because I directly asked him, is there a rainy day fund there? And he said, no. Yes. We had the opportunity to do that in the last decade and didn't.
Right.
And in 5 years, when they're back to surplus, his answer was, that's when we'll start saving money.
Yes, well, we have to remember those words, because those words were spoken very strongly the first time we had surplus.
We recorded it. Ariana, we're going to bring you back into the conversation. What are people saying?
Yeah, we're starting to get some questions on Facebook. Patrick Pinn says hopefully they will get construction started on the new hospital in Springdale, and that actually was an announcement today. $6.2 million for the development of the Green Bay Health Center in Springdale. This is something that John Hagee said was planned before. It was put on the back burner in previous budgets, and it is now back on the table. But again, one of these items, we know that $6.2 million is likely not enough to complete an entire hospital. That's one of the many items. Looking at the West Coast Hospital, $8 million. Money to keep the projects going forward, not necessarily money to actually finish those projects.
Interesting, but obviously important to the people who are out there. And again, I mean, you say that this is a nothing budget for the average person, or is it for the entire province? Because is this what the bond rating agency needs to see versus what I, as a taxpayer or somebody watching or listening,
well,
needs to see
ideally, what the bond rating agency would like to see is a cut in expenses. But again, it's based on the electorate, based on where we are in the election cycle. Is this the time to do that? I mean, traditionally, the way that that has worked in governments is that the incoming government would turn around and say, "Oh my gosh, we inherited a situation that was worse than what we thought," which was true in 2016, and that's when the cuts really comes in the first year or the first 2 years of a budget cycle. So we're in third year. We're kind of into that coast mode, getting ready for next year for the election year.
And Larry, there's one more question. There's another comment from Roger Barrett on Facebook, and he says the only reason that we've improved is due to an increase in the price of oil. Is that necessarily true?
That's exactly true. There's been some cost savings, but the biggest single factor was the fact that the price of oil has gone up. Now, quite frankly, they were forecasting $54 oil on average in last year's budget, and they got pretty close to that. It was almost bang on. It was a good call on their behalf. They forecast the Canadian dollar, however, to be lower than what it was actually, so that hurt them. But total production went up. So there was a bit of cost savings, and you get to give them credit for that much. But it was the fact that the price of oil moved up that really benefited the province.
And we should mention to our listeners and viewers that this year, in the coming year, the government is forecasting oil prices to average at $63 a barrel, and I think the Canadian dollar to be at about 77, between 77 and 79 over the next 2 years.
Yeah. So, and again, that goes right into the whole question of recession. If indeed we are at the point in the business cycle which is that we've had 10 years of great growth. Traditionally, somewhere around here, we start hearing about inflation. And when inflation picks up, then interest rates pick up, which is going to affect the refinancing.
We're seeing interest rates move already. The Bank of Canada has done that over the last few months.
And mortgage costs have gone up, right? So if indeed we get into that period of time when we do have inflation pick up, it's the two sides of it. One is that the cost of minerals, basically copper, nickel, zinc, chromium, platinum, palladium, and for us, cobalt, that starts to move up, which is good for us. But the other side to it is that it means the cost of borrowing goes up, right? And then usually after that, we run to the point where we go into a recession. So there's a couple of factors there you're going to need to keep in mind.
There was also a hint in there today that the open pit mine, they're going to go underground as well, which will also funnel more money into, and mining is a huge portion of the provincial coffers and the revenue that comes in.
Yeah, so we've been focused a lot on oil in the last number of years, but the fact of the matter is that Newfoundland is uniquely positioned between Europe and North America, and we have all these deep water ports, and we've got great access to to the province with woods roads and the like. So exploration, development and the like, we're a great center in the world for that. But in particular, if indeed Vale opens up that underground mine, and the reason for it, by the way, is interestingly enough, is electric automobiles. Is the demand for cobalt for use in batteries has gone up quite significantly. The price has gone from about $30,000 a ton up to $50,000 a ton. And if indeed they go underground, then that will be a monstrous boost in terms of employment, development, and expenditure, as well as Long Harbor, the smelter out there, bringing that in. So yeah, that's a real potential positive for the province.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to continue on now with our discussion about what was in the budget. You're watching our live budget coverage on CBC Newfoundland and Labrador, online, on radio, AM 640, and of course our Facebook feed. If you want to get in touch with us, please send us your questions, anything you want to know about what's in the budget, what you already know. If you've got any concerns, please contact us. Ariana is going to be monitoring that very closely. We want to talk about another hot button issue in any budget, education, and for that we're going to bring in Ramona Daring to discuss this, because this is a large portion of what people are very interested in, how their children are going to be educated and what happens to our province. So, I mean, what are the big points that stand out for you, Ramona?
All right, well, let's start with preschool and childcare. This is a huge issue, right? But you've been in this business long enough. When you hear a budget that mentions childcare, what goes to your mind?
Well, the cost of it, and as a parent too.
And electioneering, potentially?
Sure.
Listen, it's a pressing issue, so I don't want to downplay it. A lot of families cannot find the kind of childcare that they're looking for or can't afford it. This budget may be hinting at future hopes of re-election, certainly mentioning childcare. So there is going to be extra money to make it more accessible for low and middle class families, middle income families. And also there's a change. So families with a net income of $35,000, so after every other expense deduction on their paychecks, if they're bringing in $35,000, they will be eligible for subsidies. And that's a little bit of an increase in the previous ceiling that was set last summer at $32,000. So it's a little more wiggle room for those families who really need that assistance.
And in some incentive to get people to go back to work, because in some cases families are, you know, one person has to stay home. It just doesn't make sense to go to work if you're spending all your money on daycare.
Right, and don't forget, we desperately need to grow the population of this place, right? And if it's not seen as a great place to raise a family,
or
if childcare is an issue, then what do you do? All right, so those are a couple of the measures there. Let's talk about the K-12 system, and there's actually quite a lot to talk about there, Fred. The government is going to move on the Premier's task force on improving the education system. Now, that should not come as a surprise to anyone. Education Minister Dale Kirby said last summer when this report came out with its dozens of recommendations, many of them about inclusive education and improving inclusive education. The minister clearly saying at that time that his government would bring them in, the Premier also backing him up on that. But this is going to be of great interest to a lot of families, and I guarantee to every single teacher across the province. There is a different focus coming in this budget. $3.1 million in it for reading specialists and also for learning resource teachers and instructional assistants. So there will actually be some extra help for teachers in the classroom. That's something that they clearly told us last year on our special forum inside the classroom. We had this unprecedented gathering of 30 teachers expressing a lot of frustration about the education system, inclusive education at the top of their list. And they were talking about the fact that they've got children with different kinds of exceptionalities in their classrooms, and they have to try to work in lesson plans for all of them. There may be disruptions in the classroom. Some of the children have intellectual disabilities. Some of them have behavioral issues. So the teachers were saying that they were finding it very difficult to actually stay on topic in the classroom because they were juggling so many different needs, even though they fully support the idea of inclusive education. They were saying that they felt like they couldn't give all of the students individual attention. So this is really going to be a big deal for them, that at times they will have extra help right inside the classroom. It's not going to be for every class. But for parents and students, there's a new emphasis on literacy in the schools. Now you might say, Fred, that aren't they supposed to always be about literacy? But this, I think, is really going to be something interesting to watch. There will be reading specialists in the schools. There's a pilot project starting this fall involving 40 schools. And Dale Kirby, the education minister, saying that by the end of the next 3 years, there will be 104 of these specialists in the schools. And he says this is going to make a big difference in educational outcomes. So there's a lot to watch in this budget when it comes to education.
Interesting. Okay, thanks, Ramona. And I'm sure there's more. We're going to get you to come back in just a second. Larry, obviously, I think it was the president of Harvard who once said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Yeah, right. I mean, obviously, you got to spend a lot of money on education. How do you do it? I mean, there's just teachers and principals and administrators will tell you there's no room to cut, right. and the classes are too big, but yet there still are a lot of classrooms that are very small in small communities.
Well, there's a couple of points here. One is the fact that if you that in keeping with this idea, if indeed you do want to have the children stay in the province, and I'm talking about the 20, 30, 30-year-olds who are of childbearing age, then you've got to give them an incentive to stay. And one of them is that they can afford children here, they can afford to have better daycare, and that the education level in the province increases, the quality of the education goes up. So that seems to be the attempt that they're addressing with this.
Well, and even a couple of years ago, the previous administration had basically a bonus, an incentive to have children of a couple of $1,000s. Right. If you have a child, you get this money, no matter who you are or whatever money you make. Yeah, and that's no longer there.
I know. So it's contributory, but it certainly is not going to solve the problem.
But obviously very important.
Yes.
I think what we want to do is bring in Renata Lang from Memorial University now, and she is a student representative who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening at the university. Hello, how are you? Thanks for coming by.
Great, thanks so much for having me.
You've had some time to look at what's in the budget.
Yeah.
As somebody who's on the tail end of getting your degree, what do you think?
Yeah, well, of course, first we're happy to see the fact that there wasn't further cuts to the university. We saw that there was a small investment, but overall we're concerned that it's piecemeal solutions and that it's not addressing some of the core issues that we're looking at as students.
Last year was a really contentious year for the university with cuts, and some of how the university reacted to that, and that was all sort of part of a separate story. But what do students feel about this in terms of the cost of education here, and what they face when they get out, job prospects? How do you feel about this as somebody who's about to graduate in a year from now?
Yeah, of course. So as a Newfoundland and Labrador resident, I'm lucky to be maintaining from this freeze that they have stated that they'd like to see, but out-of-province and international students are going to see a 30% increase implemented this fall. So that was part of last year's budget. So that worries me, because if we want youth retention in the province, we need to see accessible education. Now, of course, with job prospects, we also want to see investment in job creation, which we saw some of that with some of the other projects, which is great, but we want to continue to see some job investment as well.
What are other students saying to you about this in terms of what they've seen so far in the budget?
Yeah, well, of course, not a heck of a lot of people have got their eyes on it like us, but what's tied to post-secondary education and even jobs as well is the minimum wage. So we know many students are using that to survive, but we know that it also can no longer support the cost of living for a student. It's the lowest in the country, and disproportionately women, 60%, are occupying low-paid jobs.
Now, folks who live here are already working, are probably grumbling about the high cost of buying food, getting on and off the island if you want to do that. Everything here costs more. Electricity is going to go up. How do people feel, like younger folks feel about that?
I know
the prospect of having to try to buy a house here, start a family, whatever?
Of course. I know when my family and I moved here about 10-some years ago, the cost of living was quite affordable, and that's what enticed us to come. Now what we're seeing, as you mentioned, are a variety of factors that make it expensive for students. So even though the tuition freeze has been maintained, we're still seeing the cost of living not really that affordable for students even who are from here.
Do most say, oh well, I'll probably just have to go away?
Well, so far we're seeing a bit of a mix of both. Since the freeze is maintained, I think we're going to see a lot of folks that are still staying in province, which is great, but if it continues to increase or if we see further cuts from Memorial, then we're worried that some students will leave. And what we also want to see is those who are coming here, like we said, have an incentive to stay afterwards.
Thanks, Renata. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a hard one. This is a really difficult one because on the one hand you want to promote education as much as you possibly can. However, the province makes a point in the budget document that it is supporting on a percentage basis Memorial University at a higher level than any other province in the country is doing so. So it's putting more money in per capita than any other province in the country. The tuition is the lowest within the country, so at some point you have to say, what is it that's coming out of it? Now, part of it may very well be, that I've personally always wondered why we end up with a place like Waterloo, Ontario, where 30% of the graduates are hired by Microsoft every year because it's a center of excellence that is specializing in that area. And is it the case of that more focus has to be put on to what are the industries for the future that we should be training our people here in the province now? I mean, it's a broad-based question. I don't know if it's something that you can answer, but it is something that's always puzzled a good number of us in the business community.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, when it comes to being the lowest in the country, that's absolutely true. But the jump that we saw for other students out of Province International was the largest we've also seen in the country in years. And what we also want to see is progressive taxation. So the tax cuts for those at the bottom, of course, that's good. It puts more monies in their pockets. But if we want to continue to fund these services, we want to see those who are able to make their means, corporations and those in higher income brackets, to be able to contribute more to continue to provide these public services. Not the average hardworking Newfoundlander, but those who can really afford to pay more.
Yeah, can I, if I could, and this is something we touched on again in the lockup, because we do have a very progressive taxation structure within the province of Newfoundland. Just to give you an idea, 4,000 people in the province of Newfoundland pay 11% of all of the income taxes in the province. 50,000 people pay 53% of the taxes. So that's out of a population of 500,000 people. So you can squeeze those people a bit more. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. It is supposed to be that structure. That's the way it's supposed to work, is that the people who are the wealthiest should pay the higher, the most taxes. But the problem that we keep running into is the fact that at some point there's a limit. And in many cases, those 4,000 particular group, they have houses in other provinces. And in Canada, we can easily move from one province to another by stating what our residency is at the end of the year on our income tax returns. So there is an upper limit as to what can be done there. So it's a question of where's the point of draw? Where do you draw the line to say it is the lowest tuition? But is it my question is really, is it the most effective use of that $500 billion that's being spent that's being given to the MUN as being a grant every year, or is it a question of examining what the programs are to say, here are the industries of the future? Because in the same way that we want industries that talk about coding and programming and the like, and a repeat of what we've seen in places like Ireland, where they've really turned around their economy, how do we make sure we're educating people in those areas that create jobs?
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for coming in. We've got to move on. Yep. We want to remind our viewers and our listeners that you can contact us on social media. Ariana Kelland is watching it very closely, Facebook or Twitter. Send your question. What would you like to know about what's in this budget or what's not in this budget, what it's going to cost you? So you can use the hashtag NL Budget 2018. You mentioned about the 4,000 people who were on that sort of threshold of they got lots of money.
Right.
Okay, but what about the province now that doesn't have lots of money? Let's look at the debt.
Yeah.
What did this budget do today to address that staggering debt, which, if you lump everything in there, is now over $20 billion?
Yes, so that's the gross debt. The total amount that's outstanding is over just slightly over 20 billion. Then it's less what are called tangible assets, which is our investment in Nalcor, buildings, equipment. 15 billion net.
Is what we owe.
And, yes, what we owe. And of that, 7.6 billion is owed to the employees in the province. So that is their pension plan, or a portion of their pension plan that there's no money in it. It's an unfunded liability. So there's no specific addressing of that deficit except to say that the debt is increasing slightly less than what was forecast, but there's still no
It's
plan.
less worse.
It's less worse. There's no real plan. The bleeding is less. How's that? There's no plan that we've seen that says here is how this is going to be paid down, except to say that once that we start getting into surplus again, which theoretically will be around 2022, then they will start paying that down. But there's no specific step to say here is what individual steps will be taken. So in this way, we've seen things like, there's a statement that they want to increase oil production. They want to double oil production over the next number of years. So that's a goal, right? So in the same way that somebody comes to us and says, I want to retire at the age of 60 with $3 million, well, how are you doing it? Well, I've paid off my house, and then I've paid off my credit cards, and here's the savings I'm doing, whatever. That's a plan, right? As opposed to somebody coming in and saying, I want to do it, and you say, how? So I just want to do it. That's a goal versus a plan. So we haven't seen a plan to say how that deficit is going to be paid down.
So how do you tackle a debt that big? I mean, unless there's massive cuts, or unless,
right. So
people have said we don't have a revenue problem, we've got a spending problem.
Right, and the spending problem, a lot of headlines have been out about things such as the ferry system, where they talk about the cost of running the ferries in the province of Newfoundland is about $100 million. If you got rid of that tomorrow, you'd see no effect on the deficit, right? You need $1 billion savings. And in some of the publications I've seen over time, in order to do that, you got to cut jobs, you got to cut bodies. And that's the whole issue, right? So that comes back to that 5,000 people who are eligible for retirement, and if they retire over the next number of years, then yes, that will bring down your costs, but that's assuming that nobody's replaced, right? And that the actual job does disappear. So it's making some assumptions without having the details behind it.
Okay, one of the things that we've been reporting on extensively over the last day or so is this plan, and we told you about it a couple of days ago, for Nalcor to split away from, to split the oil and gas away from Muskrat Falls. We're going to bring Terry Roberts into the conversation on this. You and I had been talking about this over the last few weeks,
Story
really.
you broke yesterday, Fred.
But we asked the minister about this. Is this optics, or what is the benefit? And you even asked the natural resources minister, what is it you're not saying? Because there seems to be something behind the scenes here, but we don't know what it is. Why are they going to do this, other than the optics?
I think what they're not saying is that Muskrat Falls is a financial disaster. And right now, Muskrat Falls is associated with the oil and gas sector because they're all divisions of Nalcor. So what they've confirmed for us today is that we're going to see a brand new Crown Corporation in this province. It's going to be the Oil and Gas Crown Corporation. So they're going to split it off from Nalcor. They're going to keep Muskrat Falls and all the baggies that goes with that project, and they're going to put it in one corner, and they're going to open up a new box, and they're going to call it Oil and Gas. We don't know what it's going to be called, but we do know it's going to be led by the current Vice President, Jim Keating, who by all accounts has done a good job there so far. Oil and gas division of Nalcor is a profitable division. It's bringing in money. They have an equity stake right now in 3 oil and gas projects. So I think it was a $65 million profit over a past 9-month period. So that's a money maker. And also, there's so much potential today. Siobhan Cody talked about it, and so did Tom Osborne. Right now, there are 85 applications in to do exploratory wells in our offshore. 85 exploratory wells. So that's a massive amount of exploration in our offshore. We've got new companies out there, about 6 or 7 new companies. So they're looking at this and saying, okay, this is where the future is for this province. This is how we're going to get things done.
But how do you attract an oil company to come in here and spend that money if it's linked to this boondoggle Muskrat Falls? Now, you also asked the question, and I think Rob Antle as well, about whether or not the province has this view of, okay, let's get oil and gas over here, our shiny penny, and go sell it to the world. Somebody else will invest in this, and I mean, if you need money, that's a good place to get it. The province has its own equity investments in some of the oil projects now. Not going to see it for a while for Hebron, but he didn't rule that out.
No,
that's on the table.
That's right. He mentioned a lot of things on the table, including making the oil and gas division, making that new Crown Corporation, possibly going public with it, because we all know there's a standard set for that, and that's called Statoil in Norway. Over. Most of that company is owned by the government of Norway, but also there's public stock sold in that. So we asked the minister today, is that a possibility for oil and gas here? And they haven't really looked into it yet. They're not really planning to do it, but they're also not ruling it out. And there's another thing, there's also another division in Nalcor called Bull Arm Fabrication Site. And the minister said today they're also talking about bringing that facility over with this new Crown Corporation and having it managed right there. But we got to remember that public dollars, we've invested through taxpayers in this province with $1.5 billion to buy equity stakes in things like Hebron, okay? And we've got about 50% of that back. And Jim Keating told me not too long ago that within 4 to 5 years, we'll probably be getting equity payments, not royalty, this is separate from royalties, of about $250 million a year just from those projects that we've invested into. So you can see that it's, it's paying off in some respects. but there's still a long way to go, but we can't rule out again how important oil and gas is. Once again, we're going to get almost $1 billion in royalties from oil and gas projects that are producing off our shores.
So let's separate that from Muskrat Falls, which this year alone, out of the $1.5 billion roughly that the province is going to borrow, $750 million will go to Nalcor, and the bulk of it because of Muskrat Falls. Before we move on to our questions and bring Ariana back in, I want to quickly talk about the price tag on the Muskrat Falls inquiry and how much money they're going to spend there.
I tell you, Fred, if there's one thing that my eyes really lit up today when I saw was that this year we're going to spend about $20 million on the Muskrat Falls inquiry. This year alone, next year, $13 million. That's $33 million. That's a couple of schools right there for a Muskrat Falls inquiry. So we pressed the minister today, you know, is it really necessary? Are we really going to get any answers? And he emphasized to us that we need to do this inquiry. He believes that we can get some answers to how everything went wrong, how the projections were so off with the Muskrat Falls project, and maybe down the road for other major projects, we'll get it right, and we won't run into a similar situation like we did with Muskrat Falls.
It also doesn't hurt to have the heat on the opposition when we get closer to an election.
Well, there's going to be
because
about a year.
it was the Conservatives who brought it in.
Right. So we're leading into an election, and we're going to have a year or more of headlines effectively criticizing what the former Tory administration did leading up to the sanctioning of Muskrat Falls.
And at the end of it, a $33 million bill.
That's right.
Terry, thanks.
You're welcome.
So Ariana Kelland has been typing away and taking questions and queries and reading. What are folks saying about the budget? What are they seeing that they like or don't like?
Well, we have lots of questions, couple of comments. We'll start off with Robert Woolridge. He asks, is there anything new about the marijuana legislation? Which is a great question because, as we know, the whole country is going to be going down that route this year. The only thing that was mentioned in the budget, correct me if I'm wrong, was the revenue that would be generated, which I believe was $2.24 million. That's what they're expected to get this year in marijuana revenue. So no new details about the legislation surrounding that, but that's the amount of revenue that they'll be getting. We're also getting a couple...
And we're still not sure about the date because...
We don't know yet.
July 1st may not be that date, as we know from what's going on in Ottawa.
Yeah, that was completely missing from the budget, any details surrounding that except for the revenue. We're also getting questions about the levy, which was something that will be gone, I believe, in 2019.
2019, yep.
Yeah, so nothing new about that. We already knew that that would be rolled back. Another question from Nicole Evans on Facebook. Any budget changes for post-secondary institutions? Now, you just spoke just then about the institutions. We do know that they are going to be doing a post-secondary review. They'll be looking at MUN, the Marine Institute, the College of the North Atlantic, similar to what they did with the K-12 review. And other than that, I believe the operational budget for MUN is getting a $9 million hit, but the tuition is supposed to stay the same, right?
But obviously, $9 million has got to be found somewhere in their operational budget over there. I'm sure they'll have something to say about that.
Yeah, and we also have a comment from Stephanie Perrell. She says, it is impossible to start out as a younger person in this province right now. So many friends of mine, including myself, with post-secondary educations, good paying jobs, cannot afford the basics of a house and a car. The government is basically pushing away all well-educated people who are essential for our future. Anyone who is smart moves for better opportunities. There needs to be some kind of advantages for a younger person here.
Well, undoubtedly, the government has heard that over the last year or so, and younger people saying, I just can't afford to live here, and, not to mention the weather and whatever that makes them want to leave. Right. But they've implemented this first-time buyers housing benefit.
So this was one of the things talking about how is this going to affect your pocketbook. A lot of the good news announcements were already released ahead of the budget. So the auto insurance rollback and the new home buyers initiative. So essentially what the government announced yesterday was that they're going to increase the first-time home buyers assistance plan so you can get a grant or a loan for your down payment. They've also implemented a new system whereby you can get a $3,000 grant for a house under $400,000, which is pretty pricey. That's not a brand new starter home, $400,000 house. So that is one thing that they have announced in doing that. So thank you for your comments and your questions, and we do still have time to get more. So if you do have a comment, a question, please get it to us, cbc.ca/NL, on Facebook, facebook.com/CBCNL.
Can we just talk about the Nalcor potential for spin-off there for a second?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. So this is the sort of meat and potatoes we'd like to hear more about. That if indeed the plan for the government is that they will be splitting off Muskrat Falls from Nalcor, and then eventually they'll do a public listing for Nalcor. That's the sort of plan that can actually make a dramatic difference in the economy of the province. Because what it does is twofold. First of all, it provides an injection of capital into the province as you sell this off to you essentially issue shares for these sorts of things. And then the second thing it does is that it provides what's called a multiple increase for your existing investment. So if indeed the total amount of money we've invested in Nalcor, and I'm pulling a number out of the air, just let's say it's $1 billion, and that's the valuation that is held on the books of the province, then when we take that $20 billion total debt and you subtract $1 billion for Nalcor, you get 19 left over, right? So that's part and parcel of what the assets are. If indeed you list this company and it lists for, say, 5 times the asset value, then that $1 billion value goes to $5 billion. So then it becomes a realistic number that effectively reduces the debt of the province, the net debt of the province, and that's the sort of thing that the rating agencies are looking for, because it's a tangible asset then that is actively being traded. So that's the sort of thing we'd like to see more of when you talk about, here's our plan for the future, show us that.
Big picture.
Big picture, show us that.
You've got another question?
I have another comment. It's really interesting about the message track that the government is giving out here. Paul Tilley says, you make a good point, Terry, in response to what Terry was saying. We do have a lot of good things happening right now when it comes to exploration. He says, government needs to set a more positive tone in its messaging for all of our sakes. We need to show that there is hope and potential. And it's interesting, when you're reading the budget speech, there is a lot of talk of resiliency, you know, how government is strong, how we're not where we want to be, but they're trying to, seems to change that message track to make it seem a little bit more positive, because it has been very doomy and gloomy over the last several years. We also have a question from Annette J. Butt. She asked, what was announced about Corner Brook Pulp and Paper? And the answer is
nothing.
Nothing. Yeah, nothing. That was asked directly to the minister, who said that there's nothing in the budget right now for Corner Brook Pulp and Paper.
Well, we've seen in the past when Stephenville Mill closed and when Grand Falls Windsor closed, there was provisions there for those types of things. Fishery, there was very little about the fishery. And some road work in Labrador, but really, but they shouldn't feel left out, those industries in those areas, because there wasn't really anything for anybody in here specific.
Right.
You know, the only tax that's going to change is 2% coming off your gas tax, or insurance tax, sorry, in the next little while. There was, by 2019, January 1st, and then 1% for the 3 following years. There's talk of the gas tax being phased out, but no specific dates.
And that will be replaced by a carbon tax anyways at some point.
So that'll probably be a wash, if not worse. So, but there's no real specifics here about that
There's no real area, and we often do get questions for these things. You know, what about my area? What about Labrador? What about the Avalon? And you're right, there really isn't one specific area that's been given a whole chunk of change out of this budget. It's very much staying the course, and a lot of things just keeping it going. You know, like putting some money into renovations for hospitals, but not building a full new hospital. We're not going to see anything by the looks of it actually being completed by the end of this year. There's no real massive pot of money. I mean, as Terry mentioned before, the $30,000 that we'll be spending, $30 million rather, over 2 years for the Muskrat Falls inquiry, that's a big chunk of change. The Innu inquiry into kids in care, only $1 million. So we haven't gotten a chance to ask the Justice Minister, but what can you really do with $1 million for an inquiry of so it's getting the ball rolling with a lot of things, but other than that, I guess we're going to have to wait until next year's budget.
And I guess that's really what the government wants to do right now. That would be the indication. I mean, the only big thing in here that, and we don't really have all the details, is this split at Nalcor. That's really the big thing, aside from the price of the inquiry. We knew it was going to be $20 million or so, but there doesn't really seem to be anything else in here.
And it comes back to the whole question of vision. You know, we do need someone to stand up and say, here's the vision for the province, here's what the place looks like in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Because as you brought up a key point, is we've heard a lot of gloom and doom about the fact that you know, something like 35% of the population will be older than the age of 65 in 10 years. Well, what are we going to do about that, and who's addressing it now? Right? So is it a case that we're going to have a commission of inquiry in 15 years saying, why didn't we look at this 15 years ago and learn make those decisions now. So we do need somebody who stands up and says, here is where we're going, here's what we're about, here's everybody, get them all rowing in the right direction, because there is a lot of opportunity there. I keep going back to the mineral opportunity, but also offshore oil. The reason why that there's these many applications to drill is because that oil that's off that coast is light sweet crude in most cases. There's some heavy oil, but if you compare it to the decision that Statoil made, for example, they could have stayed in Alberta. And they didn't. They said, if we're in Alberta, we have a problem because we can't ship the oil. If we sell the oil, we're using West Texas Intermediate pricing, which is lower than Brent. And then we've still got to knock another $15 a barrel off of it. So whereas if you drill here, you put it on a tanker and you sell it wherever in the world you can get the best price. That is a beautiful thing, but that needs to be talked about more. We need to talk about the positives more. It's
interesting that the government is willing to push this notion that they no longer are as reliant on oil revenues, down to 14% from 25%, yet it's just about, if it isn't on every page of this document, it's on every second page. The word oil creeps in there somewhere.
Yeah, but I really have to take exception with that, because what happened was that we had royalties up, and then we had income taxes down. And then when the royalties fell, the income taxes went up. So although there's a statement to say that royalties, we're not as dependent on royalties before as much as we were in the past, but the income taxes that are from the people working in the industry has gone up. So it's not a direct relationship, but we are still pretty dependent on oil.
Some more of the interesting numbers. We do have two more questions, but also Tom Osborne saying today that just the difference in the number of people employed in some of the big mega projects. I think he said in 2014, 16,000 people employed with these mega projects. Now it's down to 7,000, but he said that those are the numbers that they had in 2011. So while it does seem like a drastic dip, they were really at their peak then, but I do want to get to
historic levels in 2011.
Historic levels. So even though it is a big dip, the finance minister is saying, well, it is pretty steady with what we had in 2011. Question from Lana Collins. She asks, are there any new revenue sources? We did mention earlier, pretty small, but $2.24 million they're expected in revenue from the new marijuana legislation. I don't know if there was anything else. No. Yeah, that was about it. And Allison Chislett, she asks, are there any incentives for small business owners, and are there any tax increases that we should be worried about?
No on the taxes. Small business owners is just the payroll tax reduction for some companies, but again, it's not huge.
Yeah, it's 50 companies basically can avail of this because the payroll tax is now going from 1.2 million to 1.3, so it allows you that extra 100,000 to hire more people and not have to pay the extra money. There's really nothing in here that leaps off the page.
Right. So to your point though about revenue, they're assuming a higher price of oil. So that is a boost in revenue. But other than that, no, there's nothing else.
But they're still saying that the 63 is lower than what's been projected elsewhere. Is that correct?
They're giving it $4 cushion, basically.
Yeah, and selecting, forecasting the price of oil is really difficult. It makes weather forecasters in Newfoundland look accurate. So it's really difficult to be able to predict that, and that's the whole point of the budgeting, is the fact that you cannot control your revenue. You can control your expenses, right? So, but you can't control the revenue.
So there is a certain amount of gambling here.
Best guess, educated guess, forecasts and the like. I still question how we ended up here when at one point we were forecasting $105 a barrel. So how did the process improve? And they said that they have learned by the mistakes in the past. They did a great job last year.
Well, they use 11
different forecasters,
and they sort of go in the middle somewhere,
right,
which is where that $4.
Right, as opposed to in the past they may have selected the high end to do it, but we don't know that if that's the process that they used.
We still have some time to get some more questions. If you have anything budget related that you want to ask myself, Fred, or Larry, make sure you do so in the comments section of facebook.com/CBCNL. We do have a question here, which I don't know if any of us can answer. Brock Seward says, MUN should freeze or slow down the education teachers program due to a lack of jobs for teachers on the island. That wasn't something that really came up in today's budget, but there was a lot of discussion about putting some more resources into classrooms across the province. Of course, a lot of recommendations out of that K-12 report, but no discussions about slowing down the MUN program at all.
There was an item there about 6 months ago, and I haven't done any research on it, but it was a talk about that the kindergarten class this year is 5,500 students, which is the lowest that it's been, and that makes sense. If you have less children, then there'll be less children going into the system. So the question then becomes, as that works through, does it mean that there'll be a lower need for the number of teachers? And I don't know what that answer is, but it was something that I saw there about 6 months ago.
There's also another question from Jasmine on Facebook. She asks, is this government trying to move people away from the fishery? Well, Fred and I had this discussion earlier that in the budget document, I think the fishery had a section about this big, very tiny, nothing really in there.
With the exception of saying that it's going to be worth more than $1 billion in revenue to the province at the end of the year.
Careful. I don't know if it said $1 billion of revenue to the province, $1 billion in revenue.
In value, yeah.
Yes, so just to give you an idea, the province of Newfoundland total value of oil for salaries, royalties, everything is about 28% of our economy, whereas the fishery is 2%, right? And it's only ever gotten up to around 3, 4, 5%. So it's really been I don't know if it's a case of trying to move away from that fishery, but saying, okay, what is the future going to look like? What is the industry that will drive us within 5, 7, 10 years? Which again comes back to the question about vision. And then from there comes the question, if you have that vision, then it's what are the education systems that we need in order to meet that goal.
We have another comment on Twitter. Tom Hickey says, this would have been a lot more effective if tax was reduced on all lines of insurance and not just automobile. And this was something that Tom Osborne did address. He said that they decided to pick automobile insurance because it reached the most amount of people, and he said that they promised in previous years that when they could reduce taxes, they would, and this was the one that they decided to reduce.
It's interesting though, because it is really, as I think you used the analogy of throwing a brick into the harbor and trying to fill it up, because you're still borrowing $1.8 million a day, but sort of telling people, okay, look, we're going to ease it a little bit for you, and it might add up to 100 or a couple $100 over a few years.
Right. So again, nothing burger, but we'll just sprinkle in a little bit of candy so that it tastes a little bit, tastes nice going down. But there's not any real meat in the change in this budget, and there's nothing really there that's really going to make a dramatic effect on anybody within the province after today.
So big picture, one of your investment colleagues from Vancouver phones you, and you got to tell them in 30 seconds what this budget means to Newfoundland and Labrador's position on the financial stage. What do you say?
No difference. It's not really making any big difference one way or the other.
Good place to do business?
It still has highest taxes, or pretty close to highest taxes in Canada. It still has a slow-moving infrastructure, process. One of the discussions that came up was this $3,000 incentive in order to buy a home. What is the biggest single problem preventing people from buying homes? So I've talked to home builders, and they said, look, I've got contracts that says that I've got these 10 homes sold, but I can't get it through the permitting system. So it's not just that the tax side, it's also the regulations. So in the same way that we're looking for vision to say, how do you improve this economy? Well, part of it is also looking at mining regulations and how do we speed up the process through to get permitting happening.
And there's this looming threat of electricity bills doubling over the next little while. So somebody who's 32, looking to buy a house, or maybe going to think about moving their family away because they can live cheaper. We talked about this beforehand, and we don't want to leave people with this bad taste over how bad it is, because I think the worst budget I've ever seen was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
What's good in here that you see?
Well, again, it's the promise of the future. There is a fantastic potential in this province. I think we need somebody to step up and say, here's what the vision is, and from that vision to say, here are the changes that are necessary, and to be able to show that we can get there.
Final thoughts on the budget, Ariana?
Still lots of questions, can't answer all of it. One more thing, not sure if you mentioned it, but it kind of was let slip by Tom Osborne a little bit that Voisey's Bay may be going underground. I don't know if he meant to say that, but that's something else that we'll have to look forward to as well. Siobhan Cody's saying, we're not quite sure yet, but that is something too that possibly will come forward.
That is huge. That is a major, major development that in fact it does go forward.
Interesting. Well, we want to thank our listeners and viewers for tuning in this afternoon. We've got just over a minute left. We want to remind you that you can still contact us through cbc.ca/NL, either on Facebook or on Twitter. Ariana will be monitoring that throughout the afternoon. Of course, we're going to have extensive coverage coming up on CBC Radio, on The Go, on Here and Now tonight at 6 o'clock, and tomorrow morning, of course, on the St. John's Morning Show. We've basically told you everything that's been in the budget, but there's not really anything. You classified it as the nothing burger, no new taxes. The one tax that will go down is the gas tax.
Yep.
And you know the story that we reported on yesterday, Nalcor being split apart. And I think that's the underlying story here, that we don't really know all the details about what's really behind that move.
Right.
Is it an optics thing, or is there a bigger game at play?
And is no news
Good news because there's
That's
no new
the big
taxes.
question.
Yeah.
Well, and to maintain and, well, if not restore, but maintain consumer confidence, because I know, even as just a taxpayer, but not just as a reporter or somebody who's following all this stuff, it's been difficult here for the last few years to have confidence in what will happen in the future.
Yep. Stability is a good thing.
And the government is facing an election in, about a year and a half, so...
They're not rocking the boat.
They don't, not too much, not at this point. Well, I want to thank you for your insights into this, Ariana and Larry. Larry Short with Hollis Wealth. Thanks for your time the last couple of days, and I'm sure over the next few days we'll be digesting some more of this. Thanks for watching our special coverage of Budget 2018 on CBC.